Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Crystal Core Radio Podcast. Today, we're going to be diving into a lingering topic that has been dominating 2024 in terms of just turmoil within the video game industry. Now, we have two special guests joining us alongside Chris. We've got McDizzle back on the podcast for the second time, but we're welcoming Volte for the first time. And over on Twitter, what really inspired this episode was a conversation that you guys were having back and forth regarding video game activism. Because from one perspective, for people who are complaining about the state of video games and that there are activists running these companies, they're kind of also in a way doing, if you look at the definition of the word activism in of themselves. So we decided we're going to get together as a part of the show and break it down. Let's start with Volte as your first time here. What is going on from your perspective? And is the right, I guess, because we have to label it left and right to keep math simple. Are they activists? Is that an accurate statement?
So I think McDizzle, when we were going back and forth, I think he was right in a sense that the right, as we would call it, is forming their own wave of activism, in kind of not retaliation, for lack of a better word, kind of to push back against the activism coming from the left.
I'd say it was in response to,
in response to, that's a better word. In response to what's happening with this big push of the ideologies that the left is pushing into video games. Now, I watched a video the other day that kind of fits with what we're talking about. And some of these kind of, again, DEI companies that are coming in and latching themselves onto gaming studios, is what we know and understand is that gaming has always been a huge, not just part of culture, but a push on culture. It forms culture, right? It's the same way that it's another form of entertainment that young people can get into, right? And so when you're trying to push an ideology that can form a young person's mind, one of the easiest ways to do that is through video games. And that's why you're seeing this push from the left, and then you get this response from the right, kind of to push back on the ideology. And here's the biggest point that I want to make, right? And Ginger, you said this before on a podcast that I've watched months ago, and you talked about extremes, right? The thing about extremes is, if you look at a pendulum, if you start out one extreme on one side, the pendulum always swings back to the other extreme. It doesn't swing back to the middle.
Right.
It swings back to the other extreme. So I've always had, my beliefs have always been extremes. I don't care what side you're on, are bad, and they're dangerous, and they can have a really, really bad effect, not just on culture, but on society as a whole.
Right.
So that's where you're getting the pushback on the right, because the left, and I don't think it's a left and right issue. I think it's a activist issue that are latching themselves onto the gaming industry because they want to change it. It's another nail in the coffin of culture as a whole. And culture has a huge effect on how society is run. So when you have that extreme, you're going to get pushback. It's a natural effect. If they would have started out doing simple little things, they wouldn't have got as much of a pushback, because they went to this so extreme. The only way to respond is to get to the other extreme.
I think it did start pretty small, right? Like, because if we look at like the last 10 years, like, people will say like the slippery slope argument is weak, but then it's like you kind of look at where we are and how this is built up and how it actually affects gaming and, to a degree, movies, entertainment, because we're seeing something very similar happen with Hollywood right now. The only thing with gaming is that it takes so much more time to make these games. And so these games have been in development. Concord is a great example of this, that when it started, if it released probably how it released today, but it released 8 years ago when that kind of style of game was really popular. Games as a service was really popular, like interesting and characters would be, kind of popular, what they were trying to go for. Like maybe it would have hit, but because of that long tail of development, you start with one mindset with like maybe a vision, because, hey, we're going to try to reach out to all these like disenfranchised groups. And by the time it actually finally comes out, the culture and what people are wanting, essentially the market has completely shifted away from that being something that's in demand. Anyway, that's just a thought I had. Chris, you look like you got a thought, and I'd like to get McDizzle's response.
No, McDizzle, go ahead.
Yeah, all interesting points. I would agree that, extremes of anything are bad, whether it's left or right. Inserting of a huge amount of activism into a piece of gaming or art, or being dreadfully against that being inserted, is probably, equal on the same side of the spectrum. I think that there is, since, 2020, especially, and you mentioned the last 10 years, but I think there was an accelerated look after 2020 with the BLM pieces. A lot of organizations really jumped on the DEI bandwagon. And I think you could look at just about anyone, even Cabrutus's DEI Detected site has a statement that's like, DEI inherently is like a worthwhile venture, except like then about 16 paragraphs about why it's bad. But, that most people will see the idea of it as being good.
Yeah.
There's not many people outside of those extremes that'll be like, diversity's awful. I hate diversity. There's bad execution of these practices, whether it be through hiring or whether it be through integration of the material. You think of games like Forspoken. Would Forspoken have been any better if it was a white lady? No. I spent 80 hours in that game. I played it in the DLC.
I still love it. Like I still say, like I had a really good time with Forspoken, and it got a lot of hate. It had there was fair critique pushed against Forspoken, but I was like, I enjoyed it, but also I really enjoy Square Enix, style games, and so there's an inherent bias that I bring to any game that I play from them.
So I guess like something that gets kind of concerning to me is when there's a push to push art out of the space. And when I say art, gaming, I'm using that synonymously in this case. At what point, where is it like, I think there's valid criticisms to be had for, as you said, Ginger, people like companies not knowing their market necessarily, not knowing that, hey, you know what, this Concord's not going to be a hit. Like how to think that someone didn't have the foresight. We don't own video game companies. I like to think that everyone on this call could have said to Concord prior to be like, this isn't going to work well. Like, and looking at it from a billion angles, from the character design all the way to their
imagine if you could short titles.
Mm-hmm.
Like just individual titles.
Like if it was like a commodity to trade.
Yes.
It's like, oh, okay.
But you know what, though? If you could, I don't think they would be making these bigger mistakes.
Well, the one question that's come up, and I'd like to get the panel's.
I'm just saying.
I'd like to get the panel's response here because you bring up a good point. Like it's like if they had gotten this messaging. One of the theories that I've been working with, because we saw it happen this week with the Dragon Quest III remake, where the developers themselves say, we don't know why we had to remove gender from the game. Like, we don't understand it. It's depending on the translation you read, it's either some sex education and or Puritans. And I thought Puritans was actually a very apt kind of word because it feels kind of puritanical. And so this is coming from the creators of the game feeling like they're being forced. And yet we've seen, and I've said this numerous times, especially where like my interest in Gamergate 2.0 really kicked off was when all of these websites reported the story, but all of them coincidentally omitted one key aspect of the story. It was like it felt coordinated, and all of a sudden it's like it feels like perhaps the lines of communication they're not necessarily listening to gamers, except for, and when they do, we see the games are successful. I'd argue that Baldur's Gate 3 is a great example of the developers and the players working together throughout that early access and actually delivering a game that people found was able to celebrate, especially as a turn-based isometric, CRPG in 2023. That was like, that's wild. And that being said, is that I do worry that as a part of the levels of communication, that they have been severed. The devs aren't getting the feedback that they need to hear. They're not getting critical pushback. And a lot of it is, in my mind, due to inauthentic implementations of trying to make this a more diverse space. It's inauthentic because they're just checking a box so that they, as a business, because they, businesses are businesses. And so it's like, okay, we've done this, we've checked this box, we've done our due diligence. We can now accept maybe this money from this bucket over here, but it doesn't end up translating into actually good products that the market themselves is looking for. That's a big wide reaching things. Chris, you got some expressions. I'd like to get your thoughts.
I think it's really hard for gamers and devs to work towards a good product. As just the consumer and not the one on the production end. We are kind of the child in the relationship, and they are kind of the parent. And so, we ask for ice cream sandwiches for dinner because the last time we had an ice cream sandwich, it was awesome. And I would love to just have that for dinner. And, there might be a special occasion where you may want to give us ice cream for dinner. But if you let us do that every single day, then when we start to not feel good, when we start to feel awful all the time, we may not understand why. And you see this in MMOs a lot, where there's a direct feedback mechanism and they're like, can you just unlock flying in zones? Can you just, I don't want to do dailies. And then when they start to just give you all this instant gratification, it feels really good in the short term. Oh, they gave you all this free gold, or they gave you all these free items. But then the game loses its meaning. It loses its value. And then we're like, wow, I don't feel good. And I don't know why. So it's really hard for devs to just say, well, just listen to the fans. They know what they want. Do they? We know what we want now. But how do they interpret that and give us something that makes us happy now and will keep us happy over the course of however long a game is supposed to last? Obviously, the single player title, not that much of a feedback mechanism, doesn't last that long. But in the MMO space, that is a constant line of communication back and forth for decades. So I think that's really, really hard to solve. So it's easy to point at it when it's done well and go, that's what you need to do. And it's easy to point at it when it fails and just toss the blame. But, the other thing is when we toss blame, the first good excuse that lands is where we stop. We don't look for those comorbidities, those things that often line up. And so if you invite me over to dinner and I say, I can't come because I have to clean my house tonight. And you say, you know what? My maid has been helping me out. I have a housekeeper. She's been looking for more work. I'd love to help her out. I'm going to pay her to clean your house for you. Now, will you come to dinner? Well, if I didn't really want to come to dinner with you, maybe I just didn't want to. I wanted to be at home tonight. Now, all of a sudden, it's like, well, I told you what sounded like a good reason, but it wasn't the real reason. And there's 5 or 6 layers deep, and we don't get to those until we kind of peel it back. So feedback in alphas and betas, I don't know how people do it well. We can see it when it's done well, right? That's that Supreme Court decision. I can't explain it, but I know it when I see it.
And I think competency of the developers plays a big part in that. I mean, if you look at a studio like Rockstar Games, there's no communication with the community, zero. They might tell you what's upcoming, but the people that would play Red Dead Redemption 2 before release would have been very, very small, but yet they come out with a stellar product with every game that they release. Arguably, I'd like to think so anyway. But I think with MMOs, as you mentioned, something like that is really necessary because the community engagement is just overall so much higher versus a single player game where you just kind of lock yourself into a space, and if it's good, it's good. It's someone's creative vision. So I guess both are in some cases, but one evolves a lot more.
I mean, the pay model demands it. When people want money from you continually, they have to continually prove their value. Once a single player, once Death Stranding got your money, I mean, my buddy bought the Death Stranding hat, so I guess they did a good enough job that he's got his Bridges hat, but very rarely do they get more money out of you.
Well, unless there's more, DLCs but usually single player RPGs don't usually have ongoing updates with DLCs or whatever. But so the only problem I have with that statement is when you look at a company like Grinding Your Games with Path of Exile, right? Path of Exile is very, very in tune with their players, their player base. I just started playing Path of Exile maybe a year ago, and I'm hooked. Because the developers are a small team, they can actually listen to the player base, even though the player base is absolutely huge, because the player base knows what they want to this game to have, what things can be done better for us to have a more enjoyable experience. And it's free to play, and they're still making buku money, right? But then you look at a team like Diablo 4. Well, Diablo 4 comes in and goes, oh, well, PoE's doing this. We need to do this. And Ginger, I don't know if you play RPGs like I do. Diablo 4 came out and did a whole big update to Diablo 4 where
Season 4 apparently was really popular.
They implemented a lot of the things that the last season of PoE did. With the crafting, everything. And we were like, oh, that's what PoE does. That's exactly what they do. They just named it something else. It's tempering instead of this word, right? But it's the same exact thing. So I think developers, and especially studios as a whole, need to start listening to the actual players of the game, and not the higher ups who are just wanting to make more money.
Can I come at it from another angle?
Oh, you go ahead.
So what you noted with Path of Exile was a small dev team. Path of Exile is an incredibly taste-specific game. It is not stealing a fan base from exclusively Civ 5 players. It is not crushing people that are into, well, I was going to download Candy Crush or Farmville, but PoE just really has it under control. It is incredibly taste-specific. But you noted a small dev team. Now, that small dev team doesn't have more ears. They don't have more hours in the week to get to this large fan base. Could it also be that they're better at setting expectations? Kind of that Joker speech of like, if everything's going to plan, we'll put up with things, even if the plan is horrifying. So like, even when there is something bad happening, and we saw this, we saw this with, gosh, now I'm drawing a blank. Shooting robots or bugs, you got your choice. Helldivers. We saw this with Helldivers. They've made incredibly taste-specific choices, but they were rejoiced for it because it was going to plan. And so could the small dev team, could the size of these studios be a bigger impact?
I'll agree with that. I think it does have an impact, because grinding your game studio may be, 60 guys, and Diablo 4, because of all the C-suites, you've got 430, right? And we see that same thing with Ubisoft. Ubisoft has the problem is they're letting go of senior devs and bringing in junior devs, while the C-suites are multiplying exponentially, right? So
or they're hiring out. A lot of contract work has been going out, which essentially, that could work, especially when you're behind and you need to get extra hands on. But if you're wholly reliant on contractors, and that contractor knows they could be let go at any moment, or that contract has a finite term, it's like there's a point in which you're like, well, I need to make sure I've got work lined up for when this contract wraps up. The McDizzle, you look like you're about to say something, because I did want to kind of highlight a couple comments from chat, so I'm gonna let you talk, and then we'll get to the chat comments.
You know what? Won't you get to the chat comments, because my comment might spur some additional discussion and take you away from it for a while, if that works, unless you want me to go ahead.
No, go ahead, because we'll get to the chat comments here in a little bit.
Sounds good. I know we started talking about activism in gaming a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's something I put a lot of thought into in the context of, you think of Concord, the bad decisions that led to that, whether it was activism, bad design decisions, all those pieces. But it got the thing that kind of struck me as just leaving a poor taste in my mouth is when I think of single player games, pushing those out of the space is something that kind of I fear a little bit. Not fear, I don't know if that's the right word. I don't love that. And when I say single player games, I'm not talking about terrible AAA investments. I'm talking about those single A, double A games like the Dustborns. It might have been shit. I don't know. I haven't played it. But there was a definite movement to kind of think this is like the absolute devil. And it just, I don't know.
I put that like, Dustborn, just to jump in, I'm going to come back to you, but I put it like it's like I remember all the Christian games that were coming out back in the late 80s and 90s. No, they didn't sell well, but somebody wanted to make them, and so it's like I don't have any issue with Dustborn existing if that's the game that they wanted to make.
Yeah,
but that doesn't necessarily translate to like this game is going to be profitable. Who knows?
Absolutely, it's a balance, right, of investment versus what you expect to get out, and those expectations need to be absolutely realistic. And we talk about activism in the gaming space, like people making games that, you know, are arguably activist. Does that mean they have an opinion on something that they're passionate about? Doesn't mean they're like, you know, laying in the road to stop climate change. You know, that's a broad spectrum of what an activist necessarily is. And there's when people create something, they're going to put something about themselves in that. That's going to happen. That's inevitable. You know, on the flip side, you know, I won't bring up Ember or Grums too much, but Grums is making a game. Grums has done petitions. You know, if we go by the definition of activism, he's definitely an activist going for more regressive social action and saying that, hey, it was better the way it was before. And, you know, really using that as a bit of a platform for it. But he's going to have an opinion. People on, you know, a total other side are going to have an opinion as well. And that's going to come out in that art. Now, if large companies want to make the decision and think this is going to pay off as a risk, well, that's going to be, you know, their metaphorical grave, for lack of a better term, in some places. If they don't make a good game, even if they make an okay game, like Star Wars Outlaws, I will go to my grave after spending about 50 hours in it and saying it's an okay game. It's decent. It's a 7 or 8, at least. That's been my opinion. But that thing is tainted at this point from the online discourse around uglification of women and just wild stuff that I didn't see aligned with reality in playing the game. And also the attachment to DEI. I know there's a big thing to get, like, let's get Ubisoft, because really of Assassin's Creed Shadows, there's plenty of reasons to hate Ubisoft rather. They're more likely in the financial position they are because of Skull and Bones and that like near decade odyssey and the absolute
I think it's reported at 800 million. Like that's
it's terrible. Like, I'd rather be Sid Meier's Pirates in any day or Uncharted Waters. Like I could pick like 5 NES or Super Nintendo like pirate games that I would much rather be playing.
Was announced alongside Sea of Thieves. Like she had Sea of Thieves and Skull and Bones. It's like, I guess pirates were what all the research studies show. We need pirate games. And then we got those two announced.
Too long to make.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally like you telling me right now, I could really go for a hamburger and you're going to go to dinner in the next 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And so I go out and I start to source beef and I find a place that's going to slaughter a cow this Sunday, and I'm going to drive out and pick it up, and then I'm going to make my own buns, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to season it and I'm going to grill it. I got to go get some parts for my grill, so I may hold off on the cow slaughtering. And then in 3 weeks, I call you up and I go, Brian, I got that hamburger ready. Are you coming over?
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like, I've eaten 20 times since then. These studios just take too long.
Mm-hmm.
They're too big. How can you have a cohesive vision with 200 devs in a studio? How can you get anything out the door quickly?
If not more.
Well, and that's the thing studios. Too, is that these studios, they change over so fast. Every year you have new people coming in and new people and other people leaving. So the team you started out with in 2024 isn't the same team you're going to have in 2030 when the game supposedly is going to release.
Well, and as a 5% turnover is still multiple. It's still 10 people every year.
And every time. And that's the thing, like adding devs to a delayed project only delays the project even further, because it's not like the new resource that finally gets hired and put in is ready to rock and roll day one. It generally, if you're a like rock solid engineer, you're going to be looking at a 60-day minimum before you're actually like, okay, I feel comfortable. I know what's going on. And then it gets hopefully better from there. But it's like, it's still a slow speed up process. Yeah.
For a second, assume that you are a qualified, brilliant person that is put into the ideal place for you to succeed, the ideal job for you. And you work on a title for 6-7 years, and then you want to support that into its growth phase or DLC or a sequel. You took a job in 2014 2016 and you're supposed to still be in that job? I
Yeah.
mean, don't you want pay raises, promotions, job growth? Do you want to work on something else? Like I don't like, we sometimes see these headlines like somebody leaving a studio is this giant controversial thing, like it's a tragedy or it's a sign that the project's failing. The person could have literally like met their spouse, gotten married, waited several years to have kids, bought their first house, bought a new house. They have multiple kids. They're moving for a school system. Like all of that could have been happening outside of work. And that just demands that they look for a different job.
Well, not just that, but two other things, right? Is that these two things don't really get brought up, but I wanted to touch on what you just said right there, is that my own personal ideology when I was 22 was way different than when I was 32. And it's even more different now that I'm 41, right? Because I've ran my own business. I've gotten married. I have kids. I bought a house. Like the way I see the world is different. So like Ginger said, he said, if you're working on a game, or maybe it was McDizzle, you're probably going to put a little bit of yourself into the product. Well, the little bit of myself at 32 I was going to put in ain't going to be the same at 41, right? But another thing too is that the engines grow and change so fast now. Unreal Engine 5.5 came out just 4 months ago, or 5.4 did. 5.5's out already. 5.6 comes out in the spring. These engines are evolving and getting better so quickly now that you can't take 10 years to make a game. You can't. You're going to make a game now in 5.5, and in 3 years they're on 7.2. The engine's totally different. It's been reworked so many times.
It's from an age when we didn't have solid state drives.
Yes.
To cloud gaming.
like
it's just you didn't even build it for the right. There was an entire technology in between there.
Exactly. So it's like the idea that we're going to take 10 years to make this game, and that doesn't even point to the fact that culture changes so fast that you don't know what's going to be hype or what people want or what the player base wants in 10 years. They may think it's fun now, like the pirate games, right? But in 10 years, pirates may be a thing of the past, which they are, right? Let's leave that back there. We don't play those anymore, right? So this is the problem with these huge AAA studios, is that they're so out of touch. From my perspective, they're so out of touch with the everyday person and how often we actually get to play games. And I will say this, I think streaming and monetizing content from video games had a huge effect on that. And that does not get talked about enough. Sure. It does not get talked about enough.
You bring up a really good point, because we talked a little bit this last time with McDizzle, because I've said, like, how much of this is there are angry gamers and these content creators are giving them a space to kind of vent that frustration that they're feeling, or how much of this is there are content creators who are angry and making angry gamers. And I see that being something that pushes on it. But in terms of monetization, I'll go to Chris here. But in terms of monetization, we've seen, I think, if you think of social media and content creation in and of itself as a video game, as like Mr. Beast and other content creators have described it, it's like that in and of itself is, I think, one thing that drives it. And we know this firsthand. Chris and I know this firsthand as content creators. You play to the algorithm if you want to grow. If you want to be like, I want to talk about this one day and this completely different subject the next day, the algorithm will punish you for that. And so I completely understand when people say, like, look at these, content creators, and you just scroll their feed and it's just angry video after angry video after angry video. And it's like they've either locked themselves into a world of that's all they can make if they want to support themselves, or that's all they can make because that is essentially what people want. The market, from a consumer perspective, is demanding it.
There's enough of us that it could just be finding the people who are legitimately that upset all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to guarantee that your marriage ends, hang out with people that are getting divorced.
Right.
Like, so it is both. It is both. Like, the people are legitimately upset. I have a friend who unfortunately went through a divorce for a very legitimate set of reasons. There was no valid solution. And we had to kind of my wife and I had to make this plan about how we were going to support them through this part of their life, because we can't take all that on. We can't be their sole source of support, because when you're going through divorce, you're going to say things, you're going to talk about, and this frustrated me about them, and this frustrated me about them. And, you know, that plants seeds of frustration that weren't between me and her. You know, if I say to you, well, every time she takes the trash out, she doesn't put a new bag in, that may not have bothered you about your spouse. But now that I've said it, the next time it happens, it bothers you. And it was fine. It wasn't broken. And so if I keep doing that, and I keep planting seed after seed after seed after seed, all of a sudden you've got all this frustration towards your spouse that literally didn't exist. It's entirely manufactured. You were fine. Yeah. And so it goes back and forth. The content creator feeds the crowd feeds the content creator. And when those get separated, the algorithm steps in and goes, okay, let's get the new crowd married to the new content creator, and it moves it around. So it's constantly feeding. So the idea here is there's this the companies have lost touch. The devs have lost touch, but I don't think it's a they. I think that there aren't activists out there who hate all of gaming, like nothing about gaming, like nothing about the people that game. It's not their kids. It's not, and they're latching onto, they're gripping onto games. I'm playing them and I don't like them. Everybody here wants it to improve, but we've created a structure that just intrinsically punishes us. And the structure was built with good intentions, and the structure was built, and obviously, yes, some of that was money driven, because people do like getting paid at their jobs. Like, I don't think that's weird that a company, you know, if my company could pay me 3% more next year, that'd be awesome. So that's not a weird desire. That doesn't immediately make me greedy, but at scale, that can become a big problem. At scale, you know, these companies with all of these people, how could they possibly keep it dialed in? And so that's where the double and single, like these single A and double A games are really kind of showing a lot more, I guess, heart, like a lot more. It feels like integrity, but I don't even know that that's what it is.
The word I would put on it is it feels authentic. And when we look at the AAA space, and why, like I've stated this multiple times, is that on paper, the ideas behind DEI, I think that's why people get behind them. In practice, because human beings will human being it up, it doesn't actually work out the way that we had hoped. But then essentially what you see is the pushback saying, if you don't support this idea on paper, even though in practice there's problems, if you critique it, that means then you're this ism or this phobe or this whatever. And so it's like that ends up just creating animosity and friction, when in reality, if we could all just, you know, sit down in a room physically, that would help, because the internet allows us to punch and not necessarily care what the, like what tiers are behind the screen, you know, in this case. But I think that is in and of itself one of the kind of the core problems. It's the thing I push back on. I even saw Paris tweet this out today, and I replied, it's like, I think both sides are advocating for diversity in gaming. One side feels like they haven't been represented in a long time, and they're pushing to have more representation and support for that. But what it is it's because it's driven from a corporate structure, it just, I don't think will ever feel authentic, right? You go and you take a developer, and yes, Dustborn is getting some hate, so I don't know the full development story behind it, but let's say it's this one person, and they're just like, I want to make this game about this. You know what? Like, that's something that feels more authentic, as opposed to like, hey, here I'm Ubisoft and I'm making this game, and it's trying to pander to this group. And then ultimately they don't show up and buy it. And then all of a sudden we're all to blame, you know, in that regards. And that's how I see it. That's where I get frustrated about it.
That's the thing too, is that because most gamers are in their, 30s and 40s, we grew up playing games that were diverse. All of us, like gaming has always been diverse. Mm-hmm. It's never been a place where it's just, you only get to play, white men with swords and shields beating up on orcs. Like, all of us have played the Tomb Raider games. Those are freaking awesome. I never had a problem playing Lara Croft because it wasn't okay. So here's from my point of view. And again, somebody brought up Grums. I won't touch on it too much, but I just started following Grums a few months ago. There are times where I'm like, yep, you're right. Absolutely. And then there are other times I'm going, dude, just calm down. Like, this is not that big of a deal.
Right.
Like,
the Ghost of Yotai, for example, right? Because we saw, I don't know if you guys have kind of seen the debate. There was, and I forget his name, Andy Pants Gaming, and Ackman. And Ackman, I like handedly, I think, won the debate. And Ackman, I agree with. I don't agree with everybody. No one agrees with anybody 100% of the time. But what Ackman was talking about is like, if every game's woke, no game is woke. Like in that regards. And woke being in this case, I'm using to define the extremes on the right and the left. I think that's apt, where you're just so ingrained. But it's a divisive word. It's divisive on purpose, and that's why I prefer not to use it. But quoting the Ackman here, that's what he's talking about.
It's supposed to be divisive, right? That's the entire point of the word, is to be divisive, because we all know social media, and we all know you talked about algorithms. It pushes us to look at things that are going to get a reaction out of us.
Correct.
Right. And like you just said, nobody's going to agree with anybody 100% of the time except yourself. You're going to agree with yourself 100% of the time.
I'm 100%
I'm 100% right all the time. Right. So, but the problem is with, say, like DEI, I don't think anybody has a problem with diversity. We've had diversity in games forever. It's the problem we have with it is there's no diversity of thought. Everybody that they bring on to these teams all think exactly the same way. They all live in their ideological bubbles, and they all think the same way. They all speak the same way. They all look at games the same way. And that's the problem. That's where I see, from my perspective, where the pushback is coming from. I don't care. Most people don't care if you're black, white, man, woman, trans, they, them. Like nobody cares. Just put out a good product. But then don't get mad at us if you put out a bad product and we don't want to buy it. You can't say the game wasn't made for you and then get mad at me for not playing the game. And that's what we're seeing, is we're getting lashed out at because you put out a bad product, and because you don't want to take accountability for the bad product, you blame the people who you said it was never made for to begin with.
One pushback that I would give you in terms of just like how we think about it, I do think there is diversity of thought, but it's that the difference of thought is actually suppressed. And we've heard those stories and being report coming out, meaning that people are just afraid because if they speak up, then they're going to lose out on that career. And they'd rather have that job than essentially try to like say, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea. And what we would ultimately like to get back to, and this has just always been a pet peeve of mine in online discourse and how that's kind of trickled into the real world. But in terms of brainstorming, if the three of us were in a brainstorming meeting, the first thing I would tell you is that there are no bad thoughts, questions, or ideas. If you want to say, let's make a monkey that just paints shit all over the walls using a banana peel, that goes up on the board because we're brainstorming. And that idea sucks, but it might lead us to the actual fun idea that we're looking to try and establish. And I don't see that happening in the AAA space. I think it's easier to do in the AA space. And I think essentially one part of this isn't, I don't ever feel like it's, like there's like this being that's like, we've got to like bring in all this different, social, inequalities into these games and make, these people feel bad. I don't think there's a driving force, but I think the incentive in and of itself is actually what's going. It's just easier to go along to get along. And so one side has, in my opinion, had the power for the last 10 years. And what we're seeing there from their reaction is that power that they've wielded is diminishing. And it's and I know that the risk here is that it goes all the way to the extreme right. And then it's like, we don't want that either. What we want to try to get back to the center. But go ahead, McDizzle.
I think reasonable points. Now let's talk about Ubisoft in particular. If we look at kind of what's led them to the state where, it might be bad for everyone if Tencent acquires the majority share. That's been rumored. You may have seen that for the most part. I'm not sure if that's just been in the news today, like Tencent being interested in becoming buying a large portion of Ubisoft. I may not have the exact details correct, but what led Ubisoft to this point? Is it DEI? I don't know. What did DEI do to Skull and Bones? I know their studios were located all over the world. I don't think that's necessarily a product of DEI. I think that was in place before because they were just a big ass organization. I know playing through, for example, Star Wars Outlaws, outside of a woman being the main character, and I guess not being sexy enough for folks, I had trouble identifying, outside of it being a Star Wars product, anything that really stood out to me as like, this is woke. Versus Forspoken, I remember something that did make me cringe in the dialogue. I love the game, but you might remember the final boss battle where she's like, "Stop gaslighting me." I just totally cringed.
It takes you out of it. Like it did, that was.
Does.
There's a couple of lines sometimes in games where you're just like, that didn't doesn't fit with the universe in my mind. Yeah.
And the thing and there's a lot of causation being attached to like DEI, and we won because Ubisoft failed, and we didn't buy these games. I would agree. Don't buy crap. I didn't buy Outlaws, by the way. I got an Ubisoft Plus for like $20. Enjoyed it. Yeah. I had a good time. It was well worth $20 to me. I don't know if I could dish out 100 or whatever would be up here for it.
130 of it we're originally trying to get for it.
For the big edition, yeah. But I think bad business decisions, at least from a visible causation.
Yeah.
And of course, one could speculate around other things. One thing I really like that you said, Ginger, is, you try not to use the word woke. And I think that's a good best practice, because it's not the divisiveness, it's the broadness and the interpretation, because
it's lazy. It's a lazy word.
It is.
When we're trying to critique something, right? Because DEI, I think, does give more information as to it. Like, so you asked the question, what did the DEI aspect of it? While we can't pinpoint it, we can see that when DEI is put into practice and it shifts from equal opportunity to equality of outcome, and they're putting people in positions because they fit a certain kind of look that qualifies, that hits that checkbox, you're not moving forward in terms of what is best for the decision of the game and more. Now, I can't point to an individual thing. I don't think anybody can, because we're not the only people who could would be people who would come out and tell us the story, and then would probably be blacklisted within the industry. So it's always going to be kind of this vague component. But essentially, like you talked about the news about their like going private, like it's rumored that they might be laying off 18,000 people. And that versus then you see the news out of FromSoft where they're like, all of our junior devs and more are all getting a 12% raise. And it's like, okay, when you highlight it, which I believe that Ubisoft has done, they've like, hey, here's our, this is this group, and we're going to bring in this group. It's like, if nothing else, it poisons the well, and any gamer from a pattern recognition perspective, whether it's right or wrong, whether we pick up on the correct pattern or not, is going to see something and say, it happened here and it failed. And then it happened over here and it failed again. And then it happened here. And especially in the case of Ubisoft, that's been so many misses this year, to the point where they're pushing AC Shadows into next. And rumors are from that being a response to Black Lives Matter. And so then all of a sudden, again, that just starts to, whether it's true or not, it just feels inauthentic. And it just feels like, you've taken too much time, like you've missed that boat. And now you have to try to steer the ship of 200, 300, 18,000 people and change course. And I don't think that's a possibility. And so it's easy to say that. That's why the word woke, because Robert points it out, like the original meaning had real value to people, right? Especially with like when you're trying to get around this country and you're in a minority that might not necessarily be well received in certain areas, like that I think has value. And unfortunately, it has been completely diminished. But I still stand by that words do change over time. Like understanding the original meaning, yes, but I don't like it when it's used in gaming, and I haven't liked it when it's used in gaming, and I hate when I have to use it when it's because other people are using the word. And so it's really important to try and define it, just so that everybody's speaking about the same thing. But McDizzle, I cut you off.
That's all good. You brought up some good points. I think theoretically what you're saying about DEI hiring practices, and, I worked in the learning industry and I've written DEI training for companies. And, it's very kind of broad, like diversity is good. Here's the benefits of it. There's certain studies that could arguably say that, diverse, and, I'd agree with this, diversity of thoughts, having different people in the room, different opinions from different backgrounds will give you a good outcome. It talks about, now from a hiring perspective, if something like that turns into saying like, I want to hire this person because of the color of their skin or because they are gay versus, their qualifications, that's not a good recruiting practice one bit. what is a good recruiting practice? Like if you think about equity versus equality, is that, you know, it's tough to apply that within hiring. However, what organizations can do, and they get shit on for this, is, you know, give specialized trainings to specialized groups. In action, I can tell you what that looks like personally for me. I said I worked in learning and development. I worked in a rural area for a while with old fishermen that didn't have the computer skills, and there was no fish around. They couldn't fish anymore. And they couldn't do the jobs we were hiring for because they didn't have the computer skills. They worked on fishing boats. So as a part of equity, to get them prepared for that, you know, we would hold sessions for them to get them up to that speed, because there no other things like that existed for them.
Right.
And so I have zero problems with, you know, if they have something for women or minorities that help with that. Teach fishermen how to fish. I saw that, chat. That's awesome. How to avoid fishing, I guess, is probably the big skill. But
Yeah.
I have no problem with that, because not everyone starts at the same place. It's great to get everyone to the same level of skills and development. I'm not saying like everyone's the same, but if you can help a marginalized group develop skills so they're good game developers, or they're good at whatever they do, so they can get those opportunities that they would earn based on their merit and skills. So when I hear this whole meritocracy thing versus DEI, it's such a bizarre thing to me, because everyone should be hired for merit. You know, and if you are hiring someone based on a skin color or anything like that, it's got to be a lot more complex than that. Like, you know, and you can integrate DEI elements to improve your hiring. I've seen that in action, like not within game studios. I haven't worked in game studios, but I worked in software development. I've seen shitty implementation, I've seen performative stuff, and I've seen good stuff. So it's almost like a mixed bag, and I hate to throw throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, without, you know, pulling that good thing. Because I think if you take the good things away, you know, you take diversity away. And I like to say I don't think anyone has a problem with diversity. I know some people have a problem with diversity. They may not think they do, but at least the words they say indicate as such. Or they may have a problem with equity, like the pushback I've seen around like small groups being able to have like developer conferences or sessions. And the argument comes, why can't, you know, white people have those? I mean, go crazy, see what happens. But I mean, all these things have been open to people for a while. The goal of this is to get women or minorities into those things. So I think there's a place, I guess, for DEI, but I acknowledge the terrible and performative execution, because I've seen it with my own eyes. I worked for a company that said they were an anti-racist organization, and I think that was the most anti-racist thing that they did in their organization, was say that they were anti-racist.
Yeah,
it felt very, very performative. So, and I think that does more harm to it than good, and that hurts my soul a little bit, because there's fundamentals of it that I really, you know, I'm passionate about.
And that's one of the great things about gaming, and one of the things why I think this fight is an important fight. And when I say fight, like, it really at its best is when we're discussing this openly and talking about the pros and cons, because gaming has always been for everybody. It's like a universal language. Your walk of life, your background, who you are, who you love, we don't care. We're like, we got to go kill that dragon. We got to go do this thing. And it's so fun. And remember when these things happen. And what that does is it gives us a shared culture. And right now, and you know, what we've seen, and what I would argue from my perspective is, it really didn't dawn on me, because it's like there was always this lingering feeling, like it's like, okay, well, it feels pandering, it feels inauthentic, but like, okay, if somebody enjoys it, that's fine. The game, you know, games are selling well, people are making money. And then you fast forward to this year alone, and when all of a sudden all the sites did not talk about the Cabrutus element of Sweet Baby focusing, you know, an attack to try to get that, like, all of a sudden it's like it was kind of a glass shattering moment, because I was like, oh, they're like, this isn't a conspiracy theory. Like there's legitimate, you know, kind of like message and kind of control that they have over what people read. And they're losing that ground because YouTubers are stepping in and people are going to them over IGNs and Kotakus and anymore, because there's just been this constant sense of inauthenticity and dishonesty, and you know, just, you know, kind of trying to drive a goal or a narrative. And then when that became real visible to me, that's when all of a sudden I was like, there's a problem here. And I think it's a problem that can be solved, because just like Volte said, it's like with Grums and with any content creator, it's like, yeah, there's some good things that they say that I can get behind. There's some things I can't. And with the Ghost of Yotai stuff, I was like, you gotta pump the brakes.
Yeah.
It very well could be that the Ghost of Yotai comes out and it's awful because of all these different things, that they're like, hey, we're going to insert 2025 politics into our game for the 16th century Japan. And that won't feel good. It won't feel authentic. And that's one of the selling points that it's trying to make. But putting a woman in place doesn't necessarily, as me, didn't bother me, but I'm like, well, just wait to see. And then they tried to make the argument that the actress is an activist, that she's working for these social changes. And I was like, if we're going to label everything that, that has anybody who's ever in that mindset worked on, it's like, then everything is, and then therefore nothing is. It's like, it's going to be a wait and see. And I saw a lot of people jump in the gun on it just because of that. And I don't think that does my side any favors, right? Like, if we could be more disciplined on, like, okay, we're going to judge it based off of its merits. We're going to look at these things and call them red flags rather than actual, like, labeling it this way, then I think it would be perfectly fine. That's because history, like, again, I'm going to go to you, Volte, but history, like with Samus and Zelda and like time and time again, Lara Croft, and even about, I like to bring up Baldur's Gate 3 because people try to use that as saying, like, what happened to, like, you guys don't like these kind of games, but that's like, that isn't one. Like, that's actually what we want. That only highlights we don't care what the characters are, because the characters are good, they're interesting, and we want to experience that because the game had that. But Volte, you were going to say something.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't comment on the whole Yotai thing, is because it's way too early to know. Like, yes, the actress is an activist, and we know some of the things that she tweeted out before kind of is like, I don't know about that. Here's the thing though, right? Gaming has always been diverse. Always. We've always played, women characters. Nobody's had a problem with it. If that is their entire character, if that's their only character trait, that's a problem. If that's the focal point of their character, is that it's a woman, or that he's gay, or that it's this, or that he's black, or if that's the only part of their character, then it feels forced. It does not feel authentic.
Right. Your character is, I'm diverse character. It's like, you're not. No,
but you're not though.
You're a checkbox.
Yes.
It's insulting. It's
performative.
Insulting. Yeah. Performative.
Right. It's virtue signaling. Right. And we all know that. And then when you call it out to say that, oh, well, you're just an ism, it's like, yeah, but I'm not though. Like, we've always had diversity in gaming. That's been the great thing about games, is you can be any gender, any race. None of that matters if you just liked games, right? None of that stuff mattered. But when you can tell the only reason why this character's in this game is because they had to check a box, because they needed to perform some type of virtue signaling to the audience to say, oh, look at us, look how forward thinking we are, that's a problem. And people aren't stupid.
I have a question for you, Volta, because you make a good point there, because it's, again, if it's not executed well, it's going to come across as performative. Like, you look at CJ from San Andreas, who in my opinion was a groundbreaking African-American character in video games. Like, I didn't remember at that time playing playing a black guy that much high quality. Like, it was amazing. San Andreas, like, at that time was the best game I ever played. No one complained about San Andreas. That said, I think we've always had diverse characters. I think that's correct. I think there's been more diverse characters in games, and that can be jarring, and that could be especially more jarring if it does those things you mentioned, such as come across as just like it's checking a box, because it shouldn't feel like checking a box. If it feels like it's checking a box, they haven't done their job properly or executed on their vision. If that was sincerely their vision to have this character in this game that was an integral part to this game, but it just comes across as performative, they haven't done their job. And it would be pandering. I would agree with that. So I guess that's just the point I wanted to make. That I do agree that there's always been diversity in games. I think there's more now. I think a lot of that's been driven from various DI initiatives that a lot of organizations really drove home after 2020. And I think there's been poor execution on some of them. Does that mean, though, that I want all the different games in the world? I want the Dustborns, even if I'm not going to play them, just for the fact that, you know, maybe the 150 other people like it or something. That's it. I don't want to see a company financially fail and invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into something and then a bunch of people lose jobs either. So there has to be changes in the gaming industry there for people to be profitable. Otherwise, lots of people will lose their jobs.
Well, that's the thing, though, is that every market, if you know business, every market recorrects itself.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's what happens, is that part of the market fails and companies fail. And then those employees have to get on with a different company, because sometimes the people higher up, they get their severance packages.
Yeah.
They get
golden parachutes, baby.
Exactly. So they don't care, because they're going to be taken care of regardless. It's the developers that you feel sorry for. But the problem is that these higher ups in these companies are hiring developers that go along with their ideology and what they want to push onto the marketplace as a form of art. And when people say, yeah, no, I'm not spending $50 on this game when I can spend $50 on this game and get more enjoyment out of it. And then those people that are in the industry come at, again, like I said before, attack the people who aren't buying it. Well, then that's where you're going to get the headbutting comes in. Like that's a problem. And honestly, it's the activists that I think on both sides, not just one side. I'm not just talking about the left. I'm talking about the right too. If the activists would just shut the hell up on both sides, I think a lot of this would just correct itself.
Well, and naturally, as just a marketplace of ideas, it's that Ubisoft right now has seen so much value, and they've made those business decisions, whether with good intent behind them or just trying to check a box. Like at the end of the day, like they've made those decisions. Those games have not worked out for them, and they either have to figure out a new way forward or go under or sell, which is most likely the option. I did see an interesting theory floated online, and then I want to jump into some of the comments and questions that we've gotten during the show. But while I would say this is as close to a conspiracy theory as I'm willing to kind of start to entertain, it does seem to have, and it can have some logic to it. But the theory is floated that how much of DEI is actually a way to get these companies to fail so they can be gobbled up for cheap. And when you think that one aspect that, you know, really kind of came on the scene right around the same time as you look at the influence of TikTok, which is a Chinese company, and then all of a sudden it's like, if you go look at the TikTok in China, it's science, it's math oriented. That's what they're feeding you. Because they know how influential this stuff is. And then in America, it's like, it's willy-nilly go crazy, all of this different stuff, especially pushing out left culture. And really, it wasn't until the Elon acquisition of Twitter that we ever kind of see a light self-correction within like what is being, you know, broadcasted out to the world. And all that being said is like, while I don't have evidence that that is actually what's happening, like it would be such an ingenious strategy to be able to like, hey, we're going to push this through funding, and then on the back end, we're going to pick it up for cheap, because we see the infighting that naturally occurs in the failure of these projects. It was just a fun thought experiment.
You're right though, because it's happening.
It is
now
happening.
We're getting a word that Tencent is trying to gobble up Ubisoft.
Yeah.
Right. We see it. We see companies like BlackRock and Vanguard come in and gobble up these smaller companies. We see it with even the housing market. Hell, you want to talk about housing market of 2008? At the beginning of the show, BlackRock is doing that now. They're going in and buying up all the homes and neighborhoods and then using them as rentals. We see this. This is part of the economy and how the world works.
And when we talked about that in the pre-show, you talked about how like you've evolved over the last like 20 years, and you know, like your 22-year-old self versus your 41-year-old self. My current operating function and why I am frustrated, especially about the housing situation, is that there's a whole generation of people who aren't able to purchase and buy into the system. And that is creating them to be angry and wanting to adopt communist ideals. Yes. And I don't blame them for that kind of cultural shift, but that is a problem and it needs to be solved, because owning property and being able to participate in the system and have a family. Like if you were like, hey, I just got here to Earth and now I'm 22 and I've got a degree, and for some reason I took on $200,000 in debt and they're going to pay me, wait, $30,000? Oh, I'm never going to afford a house. I'm never going to be able to have a family. I'm never going to be able to chase my dreams. Might as well burn down the whole effing system.
I'd agree.
Yeah.
I'd like to your point around the intentional tanking. I think I read a same or similar article of Ubisoft. I don't disagree that something could be up with some sort of tanking of the products. Now, that said, I think it's a far stretch to say that we're going to integrate. I'm just picturing from a villain voice. Let's integrate the DEI and bring down the company. Like, yeah, pretty much. I think there'd have to be a lot of
sorry.
Pretty much. I think there'd have to be a lot of deliberate action, like find me the dumbest minority you can and let's make him the program manager. Like there'd have to be a lot of really weird actions to try to happen that would just be. However, what I don't think is crazy is the possibility of them intentionally doing and tanking their products and making lackluster decisions. Because some of the decisions they made are baffling. Like, that you can see from Skull and Bones is baffling. Skull and Bones.
We also know that it does happen. There's been times in Microsoft that they have released a piss poor product, and it turns out on purpose so that the stock dips, and then they can acquire a greater percentage of the company at a discount. And then, turns out better product right around the corner. Yeah. And then essentially so I've seen that actually happen in my lifetime, and I wouldn't put it past a company because there's these other games that are being played, the game of art and commerce. So fighting each other out in this regard. So, and it sucks because, and this is where, if you guys, anybody actually watches my video, I always try to end on the concept of a message of hope. And this is one of the things that when I sit down to talk to real people about this, after we talk about video games, it's you will get laid off. If you assume that your job is safe, you are at risk. And what you need to do is give yourself as much leverage as possible, make sure you're not overextended and all these things, because when these games are being played by these people that have the power, you're going to be the one holding the bag at the end of the day every single time. And if you're over leveraged, you got this noose around your neck and you don't know when, but someone's going to rip it. And they ripped it in 2008. They might rip it again, and it could go in all kinds of different directions. So what's important is that this is what I always like to say, just as a thought for anybody who's still listening. You can only control yourself. So don't try to waste any frustration on things that you have no power over. You have a concept of a circle of interest and a circle of influence. Focus your time in the area in which and things that you can control. And it's fine to have interests, etc., but don't be wasting your time, your processing cycles, getting angry because somebody said something. We saw, I saw a comment talking about Alyssa, talking about what we wanted to get white guys out of gaming. It's we can't control her words. We can only control how we react to that statement. And the healthy reaction is block and mute. And that's always been my point when it comes to what, left or right, the people making these arguments. The mute and the block button are really critical. And I think that's essentially, unfortunately, that's the only power and tool that you wield. So don't let these people who are trying to monetize, and make money and feed themselves, take advantage of you by doing that. Go ahead, McDizzle.
Ginger, I want to say there's a lot of content out there that monetizes, no one wants to, I won't say no one, but it's a lot easier to profit off the rage as we talked about. But there's very few people that have these nuanced conversations around it versus let's build this narrative and tell me what you're angry about. We talked a little bit about Kotaku and other publications. On the flip side, there's a big reliance on that marketplace as a holy grail of information for a lot of the monetization of that rage. So it's almost like the other side of the coin. And it's so tough to find moderate news that's actually, things are always going to be written by people. They're always going to have an angle. They're always going to have a perspective. And I guess, you know, the ones that get closest to the truth, and factual stuff. You talked about the Karuta stuff with, you know, the article that came out by Kotaku on it that enraged everyone. And I get it. It was a big oversight by them. And it was such a big oversight that no one looked at the rest of the article. Like, the rest of the article might as well have been irrelevant. It was just that it wasn't mentioned that the hate, like, you know, didn't give the full story. And I would acknowledge that. Like, it didn't talk, you know, it didn't talk about, I believe, the, you know, how they tried to start a campaign against him for this. And it just, you know, Streisand into that. The sad thing is, it left out some accurate points that still resonate to this day about what Sweet Baby Inc. does versus what people think they do. And the stuff's wild, man. Like, we talked, the thing that brought that thought into my head was influence. And I don't know why I thought about Sweet Baby Inc.'s influence, but I think it's pretty small. But even months and months later, it's like it's this boogeyman company that's representative of everything evil out there that has like so little influence on the games. This particular company, anyway, like if we go back even to stuff people would eat up, that's just, you know, very likely to be untrue, like a blog post from China that says Sweet Baby Inc. tried to extort them out of like millions of dollars. I read that. People made videos on it. I'm like, that's wild. So I guess the point I'm trying to get across is I agree that, you know, media, especially in the Brutus case, they left out quite a bit of stuff that would have made that complete article and totally detracted from what they did. But I still think it's wild that people even talk about that company just because their influence on the games they play was so small. Like I even see Forspoken thrown into that, and to the best of my understanding, Sweet Baby Inc. didn't even work on that. I think Black Girl.
It was Black Girl Gamers that did. Yeah.
I mean, if I'm a Japanese development company and I need to know how to write a black woman, who am I going to go to?
See, and that's why I have no issue with those companies existing. But that's what awesome, I do see in this, like, because I'm like, yeah, like consultant firms and whatnot, yeah, like if there's a service that you're providing, all right, it literally doesn't bother me. But what pattern recognition that I see, especially after like Brutus, when you start seeing it, it's like, then I actually went back in time and I saw all these articles trying to hit Square Enix for Final Fantasy 16 being too white, you know, in that regards. And then when you play the game, you're like, oh, this makes sense. This is like, they did a really good job. And what it ends up being is like, and then you start seeing more articles like that. And then it ends up becoming this kind of this pattern of like, if you're appeasing kind of this cultural left, like the articles are very glowing and very promising. But if you, for some reason, don't, you know, hit some check boxes, then all of a sudden there's articles written up about you. And what we saw happen in the past was that used to be enough to condemn you and your game, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, we don't want to do whatever. And then they would go and either change it and then they wouldn't buy it anyway. Or that, yeah, the reviews would come out as that, you know, oh no, you got a 7 because it had too much water or something of that nature, where it's just like, okay, like, and then so you start looking into all that and you're like, okay, there is an interesting thing here. So when it then comes out that, you know, like, hey, they're trying to blackmail this company into working with them, it's, for me, it's plausible. It becomes very plausible that they could say, hey, and if you don't work with us, all these articles are going to come up and they're going to smear your game and it's going to be dead on arrival. The only thing that we're seeing now is that, in a way, like we talked about, like a reactionary, it's like antibodies against a virus have formed. And all of a sudden it actually now is, it is from a marketing strategy. Like, oh my gosh, like if you get everybody on this side, on your side, your game now is 300 million, 3 million concurrent active and selling 10, 20 million copies. Like that's what I'm seeing now. So that's the history of what I've kind of seen in this space. Volte, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. So 2 things real quick. Ginger, you brought up like the worrying thing, and if it doesn't, don't take it with a grain of salt, right? Well, so my wife is a nurse, and highly stressful job, right? And I was an electrician for almost 20 years. Highly stressful job. Right. What I do, if I mess up, people die. Right. So like there has to be checks and balances in place. There has to be somebody that knows a little bit more than me that goes behind me to check my work, and then somebody has to go behind him to check his work, because if we mess up, people die. Right. So what I've learned is I saw this quote a couple of years ago, and honestly, it kind of changed my perspective on how I look at things and the way like I worry and stress about things. Because my wife would tell you, like, you don't ever worry about anything. Because for one, worrying doesn't help the situation.
Right.
Worrying doesn't make the problem go away. Right. It's just going to put you in an early grave. But the quote that I read was, if it's not going to matter in 5 years, don't spend more than 5 minutes worrying about it. Don't spend more than 5 minutes stressing about something that's not going to matter in 5 years. Now, take your 5 minutes, scream, yell, do whatever you need to do, be angry, whatever, then let it go. It didn't happen. Let it go. Because in 5 years, you're not even going to remember what you were stressed about anyways, right? So that was just on your point. But before I go off on your newest point, McDizzle said something earlier when he was talking about the fishermen and how there were no fish anymore. So he had to, teach them computer skills. And he brought up equity. But what he described was equality. Equality and equity are two totally different things. Equality is about opportunity. Equity is about outcomes. The problem that I have with equity is that when you say we're going to equal outcomes, that's communism. Period.
Yeah.
Point blank, there's no way around it. When you're talking about equality is opportunity.
No fact checking here on this podcast.
Equality, most people love equality, right? That's the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who has mixed children, like, no, I don't think most people in today's society, in today's culture, have a problem with equality. We want everybody to have the same opportunity as everybody else. It's the equity part that we don't like, because now you're trying to equal outcomes. Now you're trying to dictate what somebody else's outcome is based on another person's outcome. That's a problem, because what you're doing is that you're the person who works less and doesn't work as hard and doesn't put the time in gets the same outcome as the person who works more and puts more time in, because you need to make the outcome equal. That's a problem. Mm-hmm. What you were describing was opportunity, not outcome. I just wanted to be clear about that, because those two words are totally different and they mean different things.
Totally. No, I understand your perspective on it. Now, my thoughts on it after, working around DEI and looking at the definitions of it. Like, if I just quickly look it up, the term equity refers to fairness and justice distinguished from equality. Equality means providing the same to all. Equity means recognizing that we do not all start from the same place and have to acknowledge we make adjustments to imbalances. I think that's very broad. I think what you described is a terrible execution of it. I think the activity I described, the fisherman stuff, is a good execution of it, because we're acknowledging that they didn't start from the same place and we're making those adjustments for that imbalance. Could a poor execution of it be what you described? Sure. But I wouldn't say what you say defines what it is. I'm saying what you say defines what is an awful execution of equity.
Well, I mean,
it could be.
Well, that's where it's like you see the online kind of meme, like it's like, oh, this wasn't true communism, and it's just a bunch of dead skulls. It's like, yeah, on paper, okay, like this is something we can be behind, but in practice, human beings will human being this up, and so that's why you see implementate, like there isn't a standard implementation, there isn't a standard word, and so that's where. And then when I look at it, like we can't even agree on what words mean anymore. We can't even agree on like what this should be. And so people end up just spending their time yelling at ghosts, shadowboxing, strangers on the internet for fun or for money. Like the fact is, like you brought up the point, McDizzle, like we're able to monetize all this, and we're able to monetize gaming. Volte brought up in that regards, and how that's truly changed it. I think it's also changed, like it, for some people, it shifted gaming from this sense of fun and community to I'm falling behind. because I got to get that next video out, or I got to like compete in this next tournament because that's how I'm supporting myself. And that in and of itself, I think, is one of the things that's been also a major cultural shift in the gaming landscape.
I have a question, Ginger. You've been making content like a madman for a while. You're a machine.
Thank you. I'm so glad people recognize that.
You got 6 kids. It has to be.
That's wild, man. And
I run a tight ship.
I've done it for 4 years myself, kind of middling, just doing a whole bunch of different content, whatever I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But I do find that what you describe, I'm just barely paying for my car insurance with it. It's really changed the way I've enjoyed games, and I would say not for the better. I look at them from a different angle sometimes, and part of me wishes I could just rewind and not think about it from that context anymore. You're always chasing that, I've got to play this to record this piece of content or do this. And so, I think it's created a whole group of people that unfortunately can't chase their passion. Hypnotic, who's makes good content for what he does. Like he's good at doing the thing. But I looked at his older videos, and like there was 3 or 4 of them, just kind of some playthroughs talking about like Deathloop and like talking about like the content of games. Not a lot of views. Immediate switch to that culture war stuff. And if you're making a pile of money, why wouldn't you do that?
And if you're passionate about it, and if
you can mix those two,
then I don't actually have an issue, in that regards. What will always be a lingering question that you can never know someone's heart or their intent is like, do you even believe this, or are you just seeing a trend? And we do see that happen a lot within it, because just like within video games, this content is a marketplace of ideas, because you could put so much work into a video and nobody's interested in seeing it. And the thing that I don't know if you run into this, Dizzle, yet, because I find this just funny, is that you will get a lot of people, maybe just like there's no ill intent behind them, but they'll say, man, I really want to watch something like this, or whatever happened to like comedy and gaming and all those videos that I used to enjoy years ago. And then you look and say, well, yeah, people make those and nobody watches them. So whether the algorithm it's not in your feed, because if I don't show up on your homepage, like I don't get my videos. And the thing that I do specifically is like, while I do make a lot of content, I thankfully am able to make the stuff that I want to make and not what I have to make. And so if I'm like, I really want to talk about this, so you'll see, I put out a video on the Dragon Quest issue, which is sad for me, because I was planning on buying 4 copies, but like, all right, I'm going to make an active decision, especially at the start, not to buy it. There's real knock-on effects of that, because I know that Dragon Quest doesn't perform well in the West. And because of that, my fear is that they're going to take the wrong lesson. They're going to read the data and they're going to be like, clearly Dragon Quest, we shouldn't have done this. And that's not the right answer. The right answer is you should have made the game that you wanted to make. I don't know if they're going to get that message, but that's at least, we got to try. But that's a cultural, that was definitely a cultural war video. But it was followed by, this podcast, or, like No Rest for the Wicked content. And it's like, I'm going to just make the video, and I don't have time to play the game. And I know how the game is played. And so that's where it's like, I just see all the numbers and the algorithm behind the scenes of all these different content creators and go, yeah, it must be nice. But I was like, I don't know how. The thing I would say that the skill that they all possess is, how do they not just get so fatigued talking about the same thing every single day?
I mean, if you're motivated by money and you're making, if it's your whole income, I'm sure it would be pretty easy to lean into it. Either way.
I've got kids, if like, they need braces, and I was like, can you believe like we're gonna like as a father, like that's one of the things that like I'm like, that's why I think it's critical for me, for my enjoyment of content and what I want to put out in the world, is that my kids' braces don't rely on people watching the videos. It's like, it does not happen at all. We thankfully get to take the money, like with the editor. He helps me kind of keep the content flowing at a great quality. And then we're also able to help, out various different charitable organizations. We don't bring in a lot of money here, but it's like, if nothing else, like I want to be proud of what I make out in the world. And when I'm long gone and my kids or my kids are out there, I want them to be able to sit back and say, hey, you want to know what grandpa sounded like or great grandpa sounded like. There's a video of him crying at Final Fantasy in this. Like, once you go watch your great grandfather,
you'll be a 3D hologram.
Because the way I view this differently than anything else is that this is the ultimate time capsule that we've ever had in human history. And we're participating in that time capsule. And it's just like, oh my gosh, we can talk to the future. We are talking to the future, and it's just wild to think about that. And that's how I approach content. That's why, I don't know, that's the root of, the heart of almost everything I make.
That's awesome.
Well, that's the thing too, right? When you were talking about like content creation, like streamers and kind of like their impact on the gaming space and the culture that is gaming, is what I've noticed as well is, and again, this is from my own perspective, right? I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but from my perspective, a lot of these people, some of these content creators, some of the streamers, the reporters, the IGNs and these people and these quote unquote activists, they're not even gamers, but they know that it's lucrative to stream because they can monetize it now because of streaming, because of YouTube, because of whatever the site you may be on, where it could be X, it could be Facebook, whatever, where you're getting paid to make content, even though it may not be something that you enjoy or that you grew up doing. Right. So this is a problem that I see too with a lot of people that are in the gaming space and they've played games for 20, 30, 40 years. And it's like, you're the people who would have bullied me in middle school or high school because I was the gamer nerd and you were the cheerleader. But now that you can monetize video games, now it's the cool thing to do, right? It's all the cool kids are the gamers. And it's like, yeah, but it wasn't that way. And you're only in this space now because you can make money off of it. Whereas you would have really bullied the gamers in school. And we know that, right?
Yeah. Well, we see that from
and I'm not
the
saying
generation that's
like
above
that.
us. Like I saw something in Matt Walsh not understanding why adults play video games. And it's like, I can see there was a period where after 16, it was weird to play video games. And that was the generation right before ours, Generation X. And it was like, because there wasn't anything that really appealed. And so they kind of went off into their own thing. And so here we are growing up, sticking with it, finding, this fun hobby. I don't take any fault in, anybody who's coming into the space and able to make a living off of it. Right. Because again, like if we go back to a principle of the, an economy of ideas, like, somebody making, content people are willing to watch. And we've seen many people, women, especially, like some women have been just cleaning up, making tons of money in the gaming space. Some have been making even insane amounts of money in the porn space. And while I'm definitely like, I'll tell guys like porn is a drug, don't get started on it. It's easier and healthier not to, but we see people kind of cleaning up and it's like the market, that's what people are willing to pay and open up for. And that's where it's like if I go make that lore video on this one game that I'm interested in and nobody watches it, at least I feel proud, but it's like, if I'm trying to support a family, you're like, now that clearly isn't working.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm not saying that they're wrong that's why I said, I don't think there's a right or wrong. Just from my perspective, when I see these people come in and the big problem that I have is those people are coming in and then trying to change the space to fit their ideology. Right. And that's where this circles back to the beginning of our conversation, the very beginning from over an hour ago, is that's where you're getting the pushback from. The people who have been in the space since they were kids and they're in their 30s and 40s now, and you have new people coming in and now they're trying to change that space to fit their own ideology. And that's where you're getting the pushback. And it's, this game wasn't made for you. Well, then don't bitch at me for not playing the game. Then you don't get to tell me it wasn't made for me and then bitch at me for not buying it.
That's the market sorting itself out, right?
Well, that's the market sorting itself out.
That is true. That is true.
Marketing, like
it's
when it's coming out of like, this isn't made for you, and then you literally you fast forward 3 weeks, and it's like, why is nobody watching this? And it's like,
which games though? Has there been a good example of that recently?
When somebody said Star Wars Outlaws.
Yeah, I thought he said something similar to that. What did he say? Like I think Ubisoft is terrible all around.
Concord. Dustborn did it as well.
What did Dustborn say? I mean, Dustborn's probably, I would agree with them being like, okay, it's the audience that was bitching about Dustborn would not be the audience that would likely be playing Dustborn. Like from the little bit I saw of the game, they could probably say what they want at the risk of pissing off some people. I don't think it's caused them any harm.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt that. But the problem was after the fact when they blamed the people for not playing it, that it was never made for. That's the problem. You don't get to tell us that it wasn't made for 99% of you.
That's the equality of outcome, though. That's exactly like what I would put that into the equality of outcome, where you're like, all right, we're gonna make this game, and it's not for you, but you better buy it. It's like, no, it's I think
that's misinterpreting their audience for it.
Agreed. I think there isn't a misinterpretation of audience, but I think it's also they are still operating off the playbook of a couple of years ago, where that probably would have really gone over well, and you would have gotten a lot of people energized. Yes, we're making progress, because people like to bandwagon and just kind of go along to get along. Now it's like, okay, I thought we've already achieved this. I thought we've already done this. Now it just feels like there is this industry that is around there building this up and selling this product of anger and frustration and racism. And I think, I haven't seen the movie yet, but the Am I a Racist movie apparently is receiving like a lot of critical like excitement, because it goes into that, like, okay, we're gonna like what he called them, race peddlers, where like we're gonna try and actively inflame, like the sense, this deep rooted sin of America, because, and that is, we're gonna do that for profit, and that gets back to that full inauthenticity kind of aspect. If it is a business at the end of the day, and that's where it's like the market will sort itself out at the end of the day. And I don't have any problem with education in that regard. It's like, this is what this game is. This is what it has in it. If you like it, that's where you go with it. And I think what we're seeing is, again, a reaction to, having this power. And then all of a sudden people are like, yeah, we're not gonna keep going along with it. We're gonna go this way. And then the side that has been in power, which I would argue is more the vocal left for the last 10 years at a minimum, they don't like that. Nobody likes losing power. No one likes losing that influence, and they're going about preserving that and making all the wrong moves, all the wrong mistakes.
Well, that's what I think it has come down to, is ego. Is that they've had power for so
that's
long,
a good word,
that their ego gets in the way of their good sensibilities and their own market value. Their ego, they can't get out of the way of their own ego. Mm-hmm. Because they have had the power for so long, because they have had the power for the last decade. They can't, and that's where you get the, well, it's your fault the game did bad. And it's like, yeah, but you told us it wasn't made for us. And I think it's an over exaggeration of what they think their market is. When your market is less than 5% of the actual the actual gamers, and that's your market, good luck selling, especially if you're spending $200 million on a game that took you 8 years to make. Good luck.
I have a question for you, because you're bringing up some good points. And I think it, again, goes back to poor decisions. When you say that it represents 5% of gamers, I love games like that to exist. I don't want games like that to exist that make such a stupid decision, that spend $200 million and become such a financial failure that it doesn't bring back like 10% of what it costs to make, or something even grimmer. But there has to be that balance. And you mentioned the egos. I agree. If someone has such a big ego that they're lashing out to people around their game, that, they reap what they sow. That said, I would be frustrated if I saw some of the discourse. If I was a developer or involved in those games that failed. I'm a worker. I worked hard. I made my animations. Like, I saw a clip of a Concord developer sharing their animations like pretty recently, like the last few weeks, and it was slick looking, and the comments just trashing that's so I get the frustration
effect. Yeah, well, and that's also the bandwagon effect that also annoys me greatly. It's just that, okay, it's popular to hate on this thing, or it goes both ways. Like during a hype season of a game, it's hard to have a critical discussion about it because people are like, stop being the Debbie Downer. Like, I'm excited about this thing. I want to, and then it's like after the fact, you end up having where you could have it. So there's sometimes timing things, but I agree with you because I think people are just, wanting to be a part of the like, oh, Concord was bad, and I always knew that it was going to be bad, and therefore anything I see, even if the animations are slick, well, your game failed. like probably some kind of slight representation to the frustrations they have and dreams left fulfilled. But
it's that bandwagoning is actually what started to get me in these conversations around the culture war, namely around Outlaws, which I think is a solid 7 or 8 game after playing it. And is it great? No, but it was the discourse before it that really just blew my mind, where the discourse before when this came out was a whole bunch of people had a chance to play it. Some of them got flown out to LA, some of them were in Australia, got flown out to Sydney, some of them played it remotely. I think there's valid questions to be asked around access media and kind of absolutely that's fine. But most people that played it, not all, but most people that played it actually enjoyed it. And there was such pushback against that. And that's what really started getting me deeper into that discourse and questioning the legitimacy and sincerity and motives of people behind it.
What's interesting, but like you bring up a good point, and like what's like interesting about that, especially in the story of Concord, is that where I also look at it, we've seen a decline of interest in games as a service. I don't think it's just the culture war that's a big dream. It's like you have the industry self-correcting. We had a comment earlier kind of talking about like a crash of the 1980s, kind of thing. Like maybe that's something that's going on. And when you put all that together, it's like you have that. You also have a lot of really good games that you could also be playing. And so if you're going to release a game, it has to be like top tier, especially if you're going to ask for money for it, because my kids are still playing Fortnite and Roblox, and like they're already in that world, and they're like, why would I go want to start over in this? Like, and it's going to cost me money. I think I'm comfortable over here. And so I think you have to, like, you have kind of 3 pillars of it. You have the culture war, you have the current state of like economics. People might be not able to afford it, or like us, we're adults, like we're working overtime and we're doing all this stuff, and it's like, okay, I'll get to it when I get to it, and then turns out they shut it down.
Well, that
which
thing
is
too
crazy.
is it's my thing is that I just want to play fun games.
Yeah.
Right. I don't care about your politics. I don't care about your ideology. I don't care about somebody brought up like the diversity thing, and could it be the other side pushing it back on too much diversity? We've always had diversity in games. Always. Diversity has never been a problem. It's the forced diversity that's a problem. It's when that's the only part of your character and that's the only thing we know about your character, that's a problem, especially when single player games, when your character is you. You're playing the character yourself. Right? So, but I will say that as somebody who's new to WoW, I saw all the hoopla online on Twitter and everything about WoW, and it was like it's boring, it's stale, it's not fun anymore, that needs to shut down. Even Asmongold was like, I won't come back, and just make WoW 2, right? Start over. There's too much stuff, it's too stale. And I got in there and I got into Dragonflight, and I was like, okay, this is fun, but there is too much stuff. There's too many things you have to do, and upgrading gear is like, you need a PhD to figure out what you need to do. Right.
Yeah.
And then Blizzard took that feedback and they said, okay, here's something we're going to do. They brought back Mike Metzen. And the first thing he said was, we're going to get back to making expansions how we know we can make them. And everybody loves the War Within. They said it's the best expansion since probably Cataclysm, right? So it's like, when you have people who are passionate about the game they're working on and is not trying to just push certain things, people will want to play the game. And that's a game that you have to not only buy the game, but also pay $15 a month to play. So
and people will do that. Absolutely.
And people will do that for a good game. They just want good games. That's it. They don't want to be preached to. They don't want to be pounded over the head with politics or certain agendas. People aren't stupid, especially guys like us who've been gaming our whole lives.
Yeah.
And we're all in our 30s and 40s, right? We know what we can see what they're trying to do. And that's where you get the pushback. And if we just got these companies to just make good games, none of them will be laying off. They would need to make more room for more developers to come on. But instead, you've got these developers that are coming up going, I don't want to go work for Blizzard or Activision or Ubisoft or whoever. I'm just going to get with a few of my classmates and we're going to go start our own, indie studio. Because we're not hamstrung by the C-suites. We're not hamstrung by the investors. We're not hamstrung by all the initiatives and propaganda and ideology on either side, not just one side, on either side.
Right.
On either side. Nobody wants it. Just make good games.
And that's I think we're seeing what I would call, I don't think this is a crash, back to the question that we had earlier. I think this is just a market correction, because there's still demand for these games that come out that like, and we've seen the same thing with movies. The movie Twister came out and the creator was like, we specifically kept out anything that could be politically divisive. We just want to make this movie, and people responded to it. I think because I think it has been so much, in our media, that whenever it's not there, it's immediately recognizable. You're like, oh, okay, cool. I can actually just have fun and relax and not, worry about, this thing. I can escape the real world, for, 2 hours or 60 hours. And yeah, like I'll easily get back and start supporting that. And I think that's what we'll see happen, because these companies aren't like charities. They're not like,
no,
well, I'm just glad we lit $800 million on fire today, boys. Good work, for the cause. It's like, no, but it's unfortunate because the real people who aren't making those decisions don't have those golden parachutes. And so real people will be harmed in this, but I don't think there's a way you can go about avoiding it, because we're not going to rally everybody and be like, all right, here's our GoFundMe, for these devs who made this game that we didn't like.
I love Twisters, by the way. It was fantastic. It was really good. Had a good time.
As somebody who doesn't get to see the movies, and I saw some people getting mad that somebody said Matt Walsh in his movie. It's like, I don't get out to the theater, boys. I'm gonna wait. I wait till things come to the house.
I want to bring up a point you said around like no politics, and I think that brings up an important point. It's like one man's politics could be considered another man existing. Yeah, like from their perspective.
True. Yes. Yes. I'll agree with that. Yes.
And that's where I think there gets some divisiveness. Like if you look at, there's a whole bunch of arguments around, like, Ubisoft is done. Like, I think there's no question about that. They're in big trouble. Shadows might be a good game or not, but there's a subset of people that are upset.
I don't think it gets released.
I think they're going to release it. I mean, they released Skull and Bones.
We can get into that, but go ahead and finish your thought. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. No, that's all good, man.
I wanted him to finish his thought, and then we would just wrap up, because I got like kids just pounding on the door. Daddy, it's like, so it's like, guys, go ahead, McDizzle.
I guess that may be a good way to close. Like with something like that, they're screwed. But there's a subset of people that have legitimate concerns. There's a subset of people that are upset that the lead character is black. There's a subset of people upset about the historical, the way the history is portrayed, which I don't have a whole lot of stock in that argument necessarily, because I'm like, it's a historical fiction game. However, I'm not Japanese either, so I don't know, what, the sensitivity or perspective from their side outside of what's shared. But I guess what my closing thoughts on that is, with the inserting of what someone says is politics could be just someone else existing, where it's like like Banishers, a game, I loved it. But that would be considered really woke. There was, it's a historical fiction, 1600s New England. There was gay couples. Like, I think, one of the first mission is like, oh, thank you for finding my husband, or some, not the husband, my partner. It's kind of like tongue in cheek. But people will call that politics. Other people will call that existing. And so that's the intrinsic difference of, a lot of the discourse around politics being in gaming. And it's interesting to observe.
My only thing was, the point I was trying to make was I don't think the politics are a problem. It's that when we can tell it's just pandering because it has no real link to the story. Like the gay couple. I haven't played the game. I don't know, right? But I'm not asking you to answer. I'm just saying from my own perspective and people who think like me, is it intrinsic to the story, or because them being gay or black or whatever it may be, is that part of the story and that feeds into the story, or they made them gay because they want to push an agenda?
And I think that's
those two things collide, and you have different
And
perspectives on that.
to put it in filmmaking terms, it's like if you show a gun and that gun is never used in any other scene later on.
Yes.
Like, why did you waste your time showing your gun? It wasn't relevant for that. And that's essentially just kind of like, yes, how do we present the story and how do we tell it? And if you're providing exposition that doesn't actually have any real value to the overall story, then I think you end up getting something a little bit less than. And that then makes people question whether it was an agenda or whatnot. Go ahead, McDizzle. I do want to get to Furion and then we got to wrap up.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Like, I agree, like, is it integral to the story? But to kind of look at it, from a different perspective, if that was just a straight couple or, a guy and a girl, no one would likely bat an eye. But then it becomes questioned as a political or disingenuous moment for something like that just to exist. I guess the context for the game, just a little side mission. 2 characters, one was missing. There's a whole bunch of missions like that. In this example, it was insinuated that they were lovers and talking to their dead bodies. So it is them kind of, if they were a straight couple and it wasn't integral to the story, would that be any different than them being 2 dudes and it not being integral to the story? That's.
Do you want an honest answer? Do you want an honest answer?
I'll love to hear it.
Okay. It wouldn't be, because for mostly all of society and culture, that's normal. That's an honest answer. I'm not going to bullshit you, or that's
that's your perspective, man.
I would push back that if they were like, look at us and our like if they're like really trying to call attention to the normalcy of it, it'd be like, what are you doing?
Yes, that would be an agenda, even from the guy who said it would be normal. That if you need to draw attention to that, that's a problem as well.
I guess, is it existing or being in there? And you mentioned that. I agree. Like, if you look globally, is that considered normal? No. Do I think that's right? That's probably not considered normal. No. I mean, there's a lot of repressive places in the world where people can't be themselves, and that's not a good thing.
And those places are outbreeding us like 10, 11 to 1. So it's like,
So good luck with that idea. Like,
so it's unfortunate, I guess, that something like that, where people just want to exist and feel normal because they exist, they're not, it's going to be chastised and be different. If it was straight, it would just be like, okay, that's normal. Because they're gay or something like that, it's abnormal, and that's unfortunate. Like, I don't know, it makes me sad.
In this case, I'm not. I would just make sure, like, I'm not going to state that like abnormal means bad. There's sometimes a term people are like, oh, I'm not normal, I'm bad. It's like, no, like, you're just different in that regards. But in terms of
not
just
normal
human evolution and biology, right? Because we're generally engineered that we're going to all eventually not be around, and if you want that, DNA to kind of continue forward into the future, like, there's a normal process that actually brings that about. And that's where obviously that comes from. And it's, it's interesting. It's an interesting discussion. I want to wrap up on one comment from Ferris here. Let's see here. Here it is. Talking about AC Shadows, because like when it was announced, especially with Yakusai, I'm butchering his name. I was like, oh, cool. Like, it's not an issue, right? Like, I was like, I'm not from that culture. And I was like, AC, from my perspective as somebody who's not an AC player, I was like, it's not trying to say we are accurate to the story of history.
Yes.
The issue that I came out, like, when I looked at it, I was like, it was the gaslighting that followed. It was we're trying to prove that history actually has him as a samurai. And then it turns out like the person leading that charge also worked for Sweet Baby. So like, whether they're the big bad villain of any kind of story, they keep cropping up in these stories, and that in and of itself, if you look at it just from a pure
Pattern
entertainment
recognition.
perspective, it's funny as all get out, because it's like, of course, Sweet Baby had the role in trying to gaslight people and rewrite the wiki, and there was a battle over this stuff, and it's like, okay, it's an interesting story, but at the end of the day, like, just make a good game. If AC Shadows gets this delay and then they come out in February and they have a good game, I think it's going to be interesting to see, because I think that's where you'll see more people on the left trying to use that as a victory point. I would say 2024 this entire time has been Gamergate, point after point after point. So the Gamergaters have been putting up points across the board, in my opinion.
Playing, though, like from my perspective,
I don't know, man. like when you look at the reaction and you look at everybody's shadowboxing in this case, but I do think that's why I think Vanguard with Dragon Age is going to be, or the Veilguard is going to be something interesting to watch and see, because it's got nostalgia. Is it a quality game? I don't know. We'll find out.
Funny enough, my wife's playing the old one, and she booked a couple days off work to play this one. So
I hope she likes it. Yeah,
she might be the modern audience. I don't know.
Yeah, she might be. They might finally find it. It's going to be interesting one way or the other. But let's start with McDizzle. Where can people find you?
I have a YouTube channel. I haven't put out a video in a few weeks, but I have a lovely collection of investigating a bunch of Ember stuff. But most of my content is around just random video game shit. But you can find my YouTube channel by maybe click. I don't know. You can look up my name. All good.
I'll try to get all the links and stuff like that. Volte, do you have anything you want to promote, man?
I'm just on X. That's it. Just at Volte Thoughts. That's it. I just post my thoughts on a whole host of different subjects, not just gaming and culture wars and all that stuff, but politics and relationships and all that good stuff. So
thank you, gentlemen, for making time today. Chris had a hard out, and he already let me know. He's like, I got to go at some point. So we appreciate you guys coming on. Hopefully I think this was a positive discussion. I guess the internet will tell us if it is or not, one way or the other. I do appreciate you guys coming in and sharing this and kind of talking about it. Because, like, honestly, that's how I think we make gaming better, is we sit down and we have the tough conversations.
Absolutely.
And it's like, it doesn't happen enough. And hopefully we'll keep that rocking and rolling all the way until, I don't know, something shakes out of this tree. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining us. This has been the Crystal Core Radio Podcast. We will be back live next week, normal time, 11:30 a.m. Central, and we'll see you then.